"You seem to like info," he'd said. "Oh, I'm an infomaniac," Janet replied, not hearing how it sounded until it was too late. Her face had contorted at the realization, and the whole group had erupted with laughter. "You know, there are treatments for that now," the new partner had said, dabbing the corners of his eyes with his cocktail napkin. "Perhaps Felix could help you with that." And they'd all laughed again, Felix with his hand at the small of his wife's back. She slid next to him on the bed and kissed his neck, then bit the end of his loosened tie and pulled it off with her teeth. She smiled at him with the thing still in her mouth, like a puppy. She looked ridiculous and cute. He knew there had been times over the years when she thought of leaving him. For a while after the failed fertility treatments, they'd avoided sex, and he'd wondered if it might be forever tainted with the memory of failure. The failure was difficult to forget, not least because they'd never refurnished the nursery. Janet's therapist had advised her to make room for a child in her life, to visualize and prepare, to attract success by assuming success. So Felix had refinished an old mahogany sleigh crib that had been his father's, and Janet had bought onesies, baby Bjorns, and a rocking chair full of stuffed pandas, rabbits, and llamas at stores with names like Baby Cakes and Littlest One. They'd even had a local artist decorate the walls with scenes from their favorite nursery rhymes in low-fume paints. On one wall stood a little match girl whose hair and tiny flame were the same color as the whirling spirals of stars on the ceiling, a silvery butter. In the end, neither of them had had the heart to take it all away, paint over the stars. So they just kept the door closed, a la Miss Havisham. She was unbuttoning his shirt. Her hands dropped to his belt. The cheerful speediness of her movements stilled and excited him. He kissed her forehead as she knelt before him, working off his shoes. He hadn't seen her like this in a long time. Maybe it was the wine. He made a mental note to ask the host for the vintage. Afterward, she curled away on her side of the bed, the sheet up to her chin. He moved toward her and put his hands on her shoulders. They were quavering. "Janet," he whispered. She kept sobbing. He touched her elbow very lightly. "I'm sorry," she said, her back still to him. Her voice sounded muffled and strange. He paused. "For what?" She was quiet a moment. "I was reading this book, and it said, when you don't forgive someone, it's like drinking poison and expecting somebody else to die." She turned to him. She'd stopped crying, but her eyes still glittered with tears. "But what if you don't forgive yourself?" He took a breath. He thought he was about to hear her confess to an affair, potentially ending his marriage and his premonitions at the same time. Instead, it was just the old pain rearing its graying head. Their pain was aging along with them. "Then forgive yourself," he said. She reached for a Kleenex. "I don't think it's that simple." "Sure it is. Here." He took her hands. "I, Felix, forgive thee, Janet." He waited. She said nothing. "You know I hate it when you get like this," she said, but there was a smile in her voice. He knew then that this was something she needed to do, and this clarity energized him. He climbed on top of her and held her arms down. "Say it," he said, "like you mean it, or I'll keep you as my prisoner forever." She started to speak, but as soon as she opened her mouth, her eyes filled again. He felt her body go limp. Then she did it. "I forgive you, Janet," she mouthed, the words barely audible, and he embraced her. "Can I still be your prisoner?" she said into his hair, and they both laughed. Then he released her and looked her in the eyes. "We need to redo the nursery," he said. Things were good between them for the next few weeks, but he had a secret, and Janet was catching on. Why was he keeping a tape recorder under his pillow? How come he kept calling in sick to work when he wasn't sick? What was making him so edgy all the time? He told her the tape recorder was in case something came to him in a dream. Janet laughed at him, as if the illogic of dreams were worth remembering. He explained that work was stressful and boring if it was possible to be stressful and boring at the same time, and that his stomach really had been bothering him. Janet looked him over as if examining him, then announced that he needed a vacation. The plan was to go snorkeling off San Diego, stay in a bed and breakfast, eat clam shooters and drink white wine, sleep till noon. It was not as relaxing as it sounded. For Felix, it was bad enough to be on an airplane when you felt something big was about to happen. But the baritone in the next row was some sort of amateur earthquake enthusiast. Felix actually balled up bits of his cocktail napkin and stuck them in his ears. Janet turned away from him. After she finished her Bloody Mary, she began folding her own napkin into smaller and smaller triangles. Finally, she said, "Is that so you won't have to talk to me?" Once they were settled, he was less at home in the ocean than Pisces Janet, and at one point swallowed so much water through his snorkel that he coughed for 20 minutes. He'd always thought snorkeling, the renting of mouthpieces hundreds of other people had mouthed, was disgusting, like eating bowling shoes. But Janet seemed determined to get her money's worth, so he swam along, one eye on her black bikini. She could compete with any 25-year-old, and one eye scanning the periphery for barracudas and sharks. At dinner, they both ordered the mahi-mahi, and as soon as the waiter was out of sight, she stared him down. "What," she said, "is going on with you?" "Nothing," he said. "Look, there are all kinds of betrayals in a marriage. Screwing the neighbor's wife isn't the only one." He saw little bulbs of muscle at her jawline tense. A gull cawed in the distance, and she turned toward the ocean. "You used to tell me everything." He sat perfectly still. She was right. He told her things he'd never told any other living soul, things he was certain she would take with her to her grave. When they were first dating, they used to sleep together on his twin bed, and they could have fit 2 more people. But there was no way to explain this to her. After his mother, Janet was the most practical-minded woman he'd ever met. She would laugh him out of the restaurant. She would think less of him. "It's a surprise," he said. "You won't want to have known in advance. Just wait. It'll be better as a surprise." "I'd rather not be surprised," she said, unswaddling her knife and fork from their napkin. "Trust me." The waiter appeared with their appetizers, just as the seagull resumed its inscrutable cry. "You're going to have to be," said Felix. Back in their room, Janet rolled to her side of the bed and immediately went to sleep. All night, while she lay beside him, he stared at the ceiling fan, as alert as if the cashews he'd eaten from the minibar had been fistfuls of espresso beans. The red numerals on the digital alarm clock seemed to quiver with life. "Something's coming," they said. The Monday he got back, the head of the firm called him into the conference room. "We had a problem while you were away," he said. Felix felt a percussive rhythm in his chest. "Hackers got into our system. I'll need you to draft a letter to all your clients explaining what has happened, and you should expect an internal audit of all your accounts." In his head, Felix began scanning his databanks for possible humiliations. As unpleasant as it was to contemplate his boss reading every personal email he'd ever written,